Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's good to see you. Nick, good to see you.
Amor, good to see you.
Nick, before we talk about anything else, do you want to explain this?
Yes. So 2 nights ago, apparently, on the television show Jeopardy, as the hardest question, the most expensive question, the most money-earning question for the contestant who got this, they got it right. This popped up, and then I got emails from the craziest batch of people who actually watch.
You learn how to watch this Jeopardy.
Yeah, exactly.
Who among your closest friends, you learn that? Yeah.
Well, or not closest friends.
So
weird people who I haven't heard from in years.
So I'd love to start with the origin of this project. So all your life you've been a part of the Mankiewicz family tree. You've been involved in media, I guess we could say, as the maker of fictional film, but also documentaries for a long period of time. What prompted you to decide that you wanted to write this book?
Well, I didn't want to write this book. It was not the plan to write this book. The plan was to do a documentary about Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, based on the fact that I had grown up with them for years, with them in my mind for years. Herman died in 1953, long before I was born. Joe, I knew very slightly before he died in 1993. But they were huge figures in my imagination and mind. And so, watching All About Eve with my wonderful wife, Jane Mendelsohn, she said, hey, this movie about this younger artist who is usurping the older artist, why, that's an emotional autobiography on Joe's part. And I thought, not for the first time, God, I'm so glad I married her. And then thought, oh, boy, it'd be really interesting to do something about these two guys because their relationship was so complex and full of rivalry. And let me do a documentary. So I went to PBS's American Masters series in the summer of 2002 and gave them that kind of spiel. And the woman who ran it, Susan Lacey, said, well, it's a great idea, let's do a little development on that. Here's a teeny bit of money. You can, go do some interviews. It wasn't enough money for a camera, but it was enough money to do a lot of interviews in audio only. And I thought, boy, this is going to be a great documentary. That Christmas, I went to a Christmas party, mentioned to a friend who's a book agent what I was working on, and he said, hey, that's a book right there. Why don't you do a companion book? So I thought, quickie, companion book, that's the name of the game. I'm obviously not going to be a writer to compete with these guys, but I'm happy to do a companion book that will obviously write itself as I make this documentary. So the documentary doesn't happen because to really do it right, you would need, or it hasn't yet happened, because to do it right, you need to afford all the clips, which are very expensive, and you want to illustrate all these things in these two guys' interesting lives. But now I'm saddled with a book contract that I can't walk away from. If it were the Coen brothers or the Epstein brothers, I would have somehow scrounged around and found the hundreds of dollars that I'd gotten from the advance and given it back. But I couldn't walk away from this. So that's a rather long answer to your question.
So, which we'll get more into later, how long it took.
Yes.
This trajectory and what those years, what happened during those years.
What were you doing?
To you and to your typewriter and everything else. But one thing that you're not including yet is, but I'd be interested in hearing you talk about. You do talk about it at the opening of the book. Is it seems like part of the incentive for you was to solve a mystery in the way in which your relationships had evolved in your family tree.
Yes, exactly.
So for those of you who don't know, maybe you should quickly just make sure that we know from the top,
right?
From Pops,
right?
Well,
I'm Herman's grandson, as the question or the answer or the question points out. And Herman and Joe were brothers, born about 11 and a half or 12 years apart. Herman was older. And their father was a imperious German immigrant, a professor of languages, and a brilliant man named Franz Mankiewicz.
Here in New York.
Here in New York. Franz came to New York when he was 17 years old. He had nothing, formed a family, and was a very stern, unpleasant man. And that's putting it mildly. And so Herman, then grew up and became, so when I'm growing up, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I am told your grandfather was the funniest man ever, and he wrote the greatest movie of all time, Citizen Kane, and he died really young because he was a drunk. But really, he was great. And so that's all I knew. And then meanwhile, your great Uncle Joe, he lives an hour away from us. We lived in the village, and he lived upstate New York. And we never saw him. I have one memory of him sitting at our dining room table, and that's it. We never saw him, and I was dimly aware that he had had a Hollywood career himself. But the real thing, all I really knew is he made the worst movie of all time, Cleopatra. It was the biggest bomb. It nearly destroyed the studio. And my assumption was, I guess he's just living upstate in shame. He's worried about what people think of him, so we're never going to see him.
Was his character described at all as a part of, did the family share with you a sort of sense of what he was like as well?
Not in those early years, but then I gradually started to just pick up on the fact when I got a little older and would wander into a bookstore and look at a Hollywood book and look at the index and just see, hey, let's see if Herman's there. Oh, okay, Herman's mentioned 3 times. Joe was all over this book. So clearly Joe had more to do. He had more of a career than just drinking himself into an early grave, writing a funny telegram, and writing Citizen Kane, which is all I really knew about Herman. And I sort of, through osmosis, picked up on the fact that Joe was a jerk. And Joe's side of the family and Herman's side of the family didn't really get along. The other complicating factor here, my mother died when I was 9, which was tragic for many reasons, but also because that was it. That cemented those images in my mind. As a 9-year-old, I was like, all right, well, I have more things to worry about. I'm not going to investigate these 2 guys at all. And then the inciting incident of the book, when I was 23, graduated from college, had nothing to do one afternoon, my dad called me up and said, they're honoring your Uncle Joe at the French embassy. Do you want to come along? And I thought, well, A, I have nothing to do, and B, sure, why are they honoring him? The French, the Jerry Lewis, they had no taste. They didn't know these words about anybody. So I go along and meet Joe, and he speaks, and he was wonderful. He was warm and witty and self-deprecating and humane and just reminded me incredibly of my uncle. And it was just like the greatest guy. So that was really where I realized, wait a minute, I've been sold by myself a bill of goods, and I need to investigate this further.
You mentioned their father, and you do a beautiful job in the early part of the book, really giving us a portrayal of that nuclear family, the 2 brothers and the father in particular. Although there are women in the house, they clearly are not the focus of the behavior in the house.
Yeah.
Can you describe the relationship between the father and the 2 sons? Because it seems like, from your perspective, that becomes a huge driver into how these 2 brothers ended up achieving at such a high level in such a competitive field at the same time.
So nothing would ever satisfy Franz Mankiewicz, and you would never get a good job or I love you from him. What you would get if you brought home a 97 was what happened to the other 3 points. And it was not funny, it was not a joke, it was what happened to the other 3 points. Nothing else than perfection is acceptable. So for Herman fought viciously and argued with Franz and never got over the fact that he was never going to live up to those standards. And at a certain point, he said, at a certain point, you just say, well, stick it, I can't keep up with that, I'm not even gonna try. So he kind of crafted a persona where I'll do the best I can, but really I'm gonna make of my life a work of art. I'm gonna live life in a wild and funny way. Everything I say will be funny and quotable, and people will write it down, and I won't repeat myself because I'm gonna be an improvisational genius. And I'll live this life, and maybe, 60, 70 years after I'm dead, David Fincher will make a movie about me. Like, that would have pleased that part of Herman. Joe, sort of coming along so much younger than Herman, sort of let Herman fight the battles and just decided, I'm gonna put my head down, I'm gonna do my work, I'm gonna get good grades, I'm gonna figure out what the game is and then succeed, whatever the cost. And so they had very different reactions to this man. And then, there's his sister. One of the great Herman stories that I love is Herman, at some point in the 30s, decided, as psychoanalysis was all the rage in Hollywood, to go to analysis. He went to analysis for 4 or 5 years, and finally it didn't work. And he said to the doctor one day, look, I came here 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I've wasted a lot of money, and I came here because I was unhappy, and I gambled, and I drank, and I'm still unhappy, and I still drink, and I'm unhappy. So I think I'm gonna call it quits. They shook hands. Herman went to the door, and then he turned back and he said, by the way, I have a sister and I hate her.
First mention of her.
First mention of her sister, yeah. So that to me is, first of all, I found it hilarious, but it sort of says it all about where women fit in an Mankiewicz family.
In the household. Yeah. So Herman goes out to Hollywood first, and you give us a sketch of the different personalities to some degree, and he becomes successful in Hollywood. His much younger brother is still back in New York, and he encourages him to come out and follow his footsteps, in essence, right?
Yeah. Herman first thought he would be some kind of journalist or a theatrical persona.
I did skip over that whole part.
Well, but that's the thing. It's like
New Yorker, and he went to Germany, and he
was a member of the Algonquin Round Table. No. I just mean that it's true. The legend of Herman Mankiewicz is he goes out to Hollywood and squanders his talent according to him, on movies that were far beneath him, and is self-hating, thinks movies are crap, and drinks himself into an early grave. The truth is, he was in New York for a considerable amount of time and was carving a career out. But it was hard, and he hadn't written the great American novel, much to his dismay. He hadn't written a successful play, and he wasn't the dramatic critic for the New York Times, but he was writing reviews for the New Yorker. He was doing great, but because of his whatever. So somebody said, go out to Hollywood, you can make a lot of money. So he went out to Hollywood, and then a few years later, and he sent a telegram, which is where the title comes from. He sent this famous telegram to Van Hecht. Will you accept $300 per week to work for Paramount Pictures? The $300 is peanuts. There's millions to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. And he goes out there and becomes the highest paid screenwriter almost instantly. It's writing for silent films, so it's. But he wrote those little titles better than anybody. And then a few years later, they both graduated at the age of 19 from Columbia. Joe graduates from college.
Before Joe gets it, I'm sorry, because I don't ask a question about Joe. I'm going to interrupt now my own question.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was a fascinating thing in the book, which had never occurred to me, is this moment when silent film ends and sound comes. Part of what you sketch is that Herman, having kind of been raised in the New York theater world, he was a theater critic, and knew and wanted to be a playwright, and knew the stage very intimately, that when they made the shift from silent to sound, most of the people out there had no idea how to write dialogue for someone who would speak it.
Right.
There was nobody there who was trained in that practice, and Herman suddenly rises to the top very quickly.
Yes.
And part of what you sketch is that he then was empowered to bring from New York a whole group of cronies.
Right, right.
Now, what your claim is, and I thought this was fascinating, I don't know if it's true, is that by virtue of that, so Herman with his ex-Algonquin Roundtable personality, bringing his ex-Algonquin Roundtable type friends, cynics, wits, etc., suddenly that had an influence on the way that the golden age of those films in the 30s and 40s sound. Well,
yes.
You get that rapid pattern and the sharp leading act, Katharine Hepburn cutting down the leading man, and the great reports going back and forth. Part of what you're saying is
particularly the newspaper comedies, like those films, and our image of the hard-bitten newsman in the 20s and 30s, and I can't get any extra, whatever it is. That was written by all these guys who had been on newspapers in New York in the 20s. Herman was empowered, as you say, to get all these guys out there. So Hecht and MacArthur and Libby, Nunley John, like all these guys who had been in New York in the newspaper world went out to Hollywood, and they created the image that we now know of as the wisecracking newspaperman of the 20s and 30s, which kind of, and those films, the front page, and they kind of reached the apotheosis in Citizen Kane, where Kane obviously is a newspaper publisher. So getting back to Joe.
Yeah. So then Joe goes.
So the real difference here is Herman never took any of it that seriously. So he was just like, yeah, let's do it. We'll write these things, but can't we get somebody to do the actual work? So he sends a telegram to Joe, who graduated from college, didn't know what he was doing, bummed around Europe as Herman had, and then Herman sent him a telegram, which isn't quite as witty, just for Christ's sake, come to Hollywood. So Joe goes out there and starts a sort of, I don't want to say starts it, but there's a second wave of screenwriters who take it seriously. They don't see movies as beneath them. They see movies as the great American art form of the 20th century, and they're going to learn the craft, study it at the feet of the masters like Herman and Hecht, who got out there first, and apply themselves diligently to the work. And what ends up happening is Herman is up here and Joe is making his way up, and all these sort of Sammy clicks, what makes Sammy run, those people kind of rise in Hollywood, and Herman and his cronies, and Herman in particular, sinks.
And part of that, and again, it's a very interesting sort of moment in the history of Hollywood, is that Joe was prepared to be a company man.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, as you say, it's learning the craft of screenwriting from the masters and taking the industry seriously and not condescending to it. But on the other hand, it's also recognizing, so in essence, the corporate structure.
Yes.
And being very willing to accept his place within the corporate structure and play whatever game was necessary to navigate that and advance through it over time, which the old guys would never have been willing to do.
No. And Herman was, anti-authoritarian, to a fault. And Joe learned very quickly, you've got to, I think the quote is something like, you got to shake the hands of the sons of bitches who you hate.
Which he did.
Which he did.
On occasion.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that was sort of the dynamic that was going on in Hollywood while the two of them were together there for 2 decades.
So you've got this sort of rising and the decline, going on after Joe's arrival. But at the same time, when he first comes out, it seems like you describe their relationship. There was a certain symbiosis between them, that they both, to some degree, benefit from each other being there at a certain point.
Yes, it's good for Joe because he's the younger son of the greatest writer in town, and it's good for Herman because he's got this, go get him, screenwriter or producer or whatever who's working away and impressing everyone with his slick, he's also, he was better looking than Herman. He kept himself in better shape, and he wasn't nearly as magnetic a charisma, but he did well, and everybody sort of, they liked it at the studio. They didn't really seem to respect him that much. He wasn't nearly as respected as Herman, and it bothered him. And he was, he was a member of the studio. He was a member. He became management, became a producer, And then he fired, famously, S. Scott Fitzgerald. So that's not going to endear you to the creative class, or Fitzgerald. We called him, Fitzgerald called him Monkey Bitch.
Walk us through Citizen Kane. If we'll talk about all about even in a minute, Joe's triumph there. But what does it take? And why was Herman the right person at the right time in a way to write Citizen Kane?
Well, because he didn't respect the form of the screenplay. And so here comes a young, and he didn't respect the town, Hollywood. And so here comes a young genius, Orson Welles, who says, write anything you want, write it the way you want. And we're gonna show this town what you can really do with this magical train set that is the Hollywood studio system. So, you know, and everybody in Hollywood, like that was a famous thing that we've talked about, that, you know, they couldn't believe Orson Welles' arrogance, and, you know, because he said, like, well, this is the greatest train set a boy ever had. And they just thought, oh, what an arrogant, you know, it's like, well, what do you mean? It is. Like, it's a fabulous set of toys for a creative person. And Orson Welles decided to put it to work. And so he enlisted, obviously not just Herman, but all these fantastic artisans and artists to make their masterpiece and push themselves. Hey, Greg Toland, what have you always wanted to do? Well, I wanted to shoot ceilings. Okay, well then we'll shoot ceilings, you know. And more interesting things even than shooting ceilings. When I was a kid, my mom said, yes, you know, it's the first movie that ever showed ceilings. Wow! First of all, who cares? But, and that's not even Herman's doing. Herman said, and we see the ceiling. But so I think that Welles found Herman also really at a low point. He had been fired from every studio by that point. In fact, at one point, one of the producers at MGM said, yeah, we're firing you, and not only that, we're going to make sure that you never work at any studio in town. And Herman said, promises, promises. So, you know, that's when Welles found him, and so he was reignited by the possibility of like, oh, well, this could be good, and so he really threw himself into it. He took care of himself, and
which means he drank less.
He drank less. It's not like there was a trunk of alcohol on the other side of the room that he couldn't get to. He went down. He and Houseman every night went and had a drink at the canteen at Victorville. I'm acting like everybody has inhaled and memorized the movie Mank, by the way. But Herman took care of himself and did the best work of his life, which he started to sense, and he also started to sense, this is a bad deal. I'm getting decent money, but I agreed not to have my name on this. Because Orson Welles was part of the deal with Orson Welles, that he was such an auteur, that it was like a one-man show, and everybody who listened to the radio and listened to the War of the Worlds knew, well, that's Orson Welles, I mean, he does everything. But Herman started to realize, like, yeah, but I'm a screenwriter, and this is a pretty good script, and I'd like my name on it. So that kind of meant that they were never going to work together again, because then Herman started to cause trouble. Not that he shouldn't have, but, and Welles ultimately said, yeah, all right, well, let's share credit, and, you know, your name can go first.
Yeah, it's an amazing victory.
Brilliant, yeah.
What about Herman's background made him the right guy to write Citizen?
They said, Herman said, let's do a life of a great man, and this great man, great in quotes, will be a newspaper publisher. So I'm going to use all the stuff I know about newspapers and pour it into this guy, and I am going to, you know, sort of pour in some anti-authoritarianism so that we're not going to like this guy that much. And Welles, playing the role and doing some rewriting, said, no, but I'm playing him, and so we're going to love this man. And so that tension between Herman sort of wanting to take Kane down and Welles wanting to prop Kane up also is one of the things that makes Kane, I think, such a fascinating figure.
So let's shift to Joe. I don't want to leave time for people to ask questions as well. But when look at Joe, whose breadth of achievement is very broad, very big.
Yeah.
And it's both as a writer, as a producer, as a director. He's done all of it, and all for an extraordinary film in each case, in many ways. But all that he really seems to stand out in this incredible body of work as an especially incredible body, especially incredible creation. Walk us through that. What do you think? And that's the case where he directed and wrote it.
Yes. So Joe had, Joe always knew, well, the person to be on a movie set is the director. But he was told by Louis B. Mayer, you have to, run before you can walk, or walk before you can run, so you should produce. So Joe diligently produced for years. He produced a lot of great movies, Philadelphia Story, Fury, Woman of the Year. And then he was ready to direct. So then he starts directing, and he did that, he did 5 films, and then he was sort of like, okay, now I'm ready to write my own stuff and direct those. So he started those, and they got better and better. And he did Letter to Three Wives, and a terrific movie, and he won the Oscar for Best Writer and Best Director for that film. And then he wrote All About Eve, which is, I think it is head and shoulders above Joe's other movies. Not that these other movies aren't really good, and Suddenly Last Summer is good, and Cleopatra we can get to, it has problems, but it's not nearly the worst movie ever. But I think it's the same thing. It's Joe loved theater, so he was drawing on his love of theater. He loved actors and actresses, more relevantly, and so he was drawing on that. And at the heart of it is this relationship between Eve Harrington, younger, colder, ambitious, not really liked by most people, and Margot Channing, beloved, larger-than-life, self-destructive, charismatic, wonderful Betty Davis, between Joe and Herman. And I think that that's what made the movie work as well as it does. Joe, who, like Herman, got into psychoanalysis, and told he's the one responsible for getting Judy Garland into psychoanalysis. And his characters are so well drawn and so psychologically astute. If you watch All About Eve, the characters are great, especially the female characters, or Addison DeWitt also among men. But he refused to engage. His first biographer put to him, well, what about this idea? Because it wasn't original, I didn't notice at the time, but it wasn't original to Jane, that this maybe is where you draw it. And he said, absolutely not. Herman had nothing to do with All About Eve. I had nothing to do with Citizen Kane. And it's like, why would somebody resist so much what seems to be a fairly obvious interpretation, or at least why wouldn't he say, gee, that's really interesting, I never thought of that. Oh gosh, given that I work in characters and theory, like I would be willing to entertain that, but he wouldn't go there. And I think he wouldn't go there for a lot of reasons, one of which is he didn't want Herman anywhere near his greatest achievement, which I think he knew All About Eve was.
So you said that when did you sign the contract to write this book? So let's go back to
the summer of 2002
right.
is when I started doing the interviews and stuff. And then at Christmas, met the agent, and then we did a proposal, and I signed it in May of 2003. Before my youngest daughter.
Almost 20. Tell us about that. And of course, for those of you who in here who know Nick, and some of you do, that's part of the pleasure is knowing this was out there, looming, drifting.
Yeah, it wasn't a pleasure.
Following you in the down dark alleys.
No, it was an albatross. For years, it was this thing that I had said I was going to do that I wasn't doing, and I started writing it, and it was very dull. It was very boring. It was putting it was like a long Wikipedia entry about these two guys. And it was just bad. And then I had an insight, or what I thought was an insight, in 2012. So it had been 10 years in. 10 years in. And it was humiliating, because my cousins or somebody would say, like, hey, what happened to that book? And you're like, yeah, no, I'm working on it. And I sort of was, but it was just bad. And then I had an insight that, I know what the problem is here. This book should not be about these two men. This book should be about three men, Herman and Joe and me. So I wrote it, and I wrote this book that went back and forth between these amazing parallels between Herman's life and my life, and Joe's life and my life, and Herman's life and my life, all these fascinating things. And I delivered it to my editor, and she said, great, well, so this is what you needed to do in order to write it. Now take yourself out. And so for a year, I kicked and screamed. And then one afternoon, I said, well, fuck, let me just see what it looks like. And I went through and I just pulled all the Nick stuff out and saved it in a file and read it through. And I thought, aha, okay, she's right. This book now has a perspective. This is not a dual biography. This is a dual portrait. I'm not in it very much. My story isn't in it. And certainly the parallels between my life and you're not getting that. Which is good for you. But it's coming from me, and it's coming from my experience and my feelings about them, and the book had found its voice. I still had a lot of work to do, a little bit more research to do, but mostly just like now I just need to write it. I don't quite understand why it still took another 8 or 9 years, but it did.
You were busy.
I was busy.
So what about the process? So over that 20-year time frame, like when you began, did you begin by interviewing people, by reading books about them? Did you by watching movies? And so how did that evolve over the course of the 20 years?
So the first part of the process was really fun. It was just watching as many movies as I could get my hands on, and it was reading the books, and then also reading, both of these guys, Herman and Joe, had biographies done about them in the 70s. And both of those writers, who have sadly since passed, gave me all of their interviews. So not just the final manuscript, but I had all of their tapes and transcripts. So I had thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of transcript and actual tapes of people Orson Welles being interviewed in the 70s, and Hugh Cronin when he was more robust than when I would have gotten to him. And for me, significantly, my mother's voice, which I had not heard in 30 years. And then I'm listening to her talk about her father or talk about her uncle. So that process really was what I was doing when I was writing the bad version. And then when I started to write the existent version, I had done all the research, and then it was just a matter of like, okay, hey, where was that story? I remember this great story, this can go here, and it was much easier. That was the process.
Over the course of that process, what was the biggest changes in the way that you ended up seeing your grandfather and great uncle?
I think overall, I just started to, really, I would get mad at both of them for various things during the course of the writing of the book. But I hope, come to accept them or the versions of them that I imagined existed. And I came to have enormous sympathy for her. I began with a Herman, I was privileged in Herman, so I always loved Herman. So in some ways I became sort of more irritated with Herman, but also more sympathetic. Like, he was an alcoholic, and he wasn't, he didn't get the help he needed. But sometimes he would say, you're working on all these things that we now consider to be this is Hollywood's golden age. This is not beneath you. This is a totally legitimate thing you're doing. And that would be frustrating. But his self-destructive streak was just so relentless. And then for Joe, I think I came to really understand him in a much deeper way than I ever had before.
Did you have a more heroic sense of your grandmother? I did. But if you read through what she, how she's, because Herman was not an easy husband. He was loyal, but by drinking and gambling, he made life very difficult. They had to constantly mortgage the house and move out to a smaller place and then work their way back into the house and all kinds of things. But she seems heroic.
Yeah, she was kind of heroic. I didn't realize, when I was growing up, I I thought, Herman was the greatest guy ever, and they had had a wonderful marriage. Well, their marriage got a lot better after he died. In retrospect, he was great, but he was not happy. I mean, as you say, they were, oh, sorry, we have to leave the house and go find another place to live. We'll try and stay in the school district. But it must have been deeply humiliating.
The last question for me is, as someone who was a very accomplished documentarian, how did that affect the way that you pieced together the project? In other words, you had done work on strangers, but all of a sudden here you're digging into your family. But so how did your art as a documentarian influence this book?
That's a great question, Amor. I don't know. My sense is that what I try and do in my documentary work is what I try to do here, which is to say, make these characters come to life, make it entertaining. I don't like the word documentary. It just feels like medicine. So I'm always thinking that let's make this film, which I guess other people will call a documentary, let's make it as entertaining as fiction, as a drama or a comedy or whatever. And likewise, I don't think I'm that fond of the word biography. So I wanted this to be a portrait. I wanted it to have the feel sometimes of fiction. And I do some things that probably traditional biographers wouldn't want you to do. And I know they don't want you to do. You're not supposed to try and imagine what people are thinking. You can't know what they were thinking. And it's like, no, I can't, but this is a portrait, so I can. So I think it was that, and it was being free enough to explore, do all the research, and then say, all right, now I have to create this.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that there's questions from people here. So anybody who would like to ask a question? Sir,
I have a question.
please.
So I'm curious, as
Would you like to use that?
as you're digging and exhuming family history, what impact did this have on you, your understanding of your own family? Did it change in any way? Did you come across information or news that were revealing or earth-shaking, and did it have more of a than passing, let's say, impact? Was there anything transformative, engaging?
I think it was transformative. It was transformative to finish. And I don't think it would have been transformative just to finish a project that had been hanging over your head for 19 years. I think because it was about them and these two guys, and sort of standing, my relationship to these two men, who were so huge in my head for so long, did change. And I think I started, in the way that, well, I don't know, your parents exist in your head beyond childhood. And you'll do something sometimes and think, oh my God, I'm just so much like my dad, that's disgusting. Or, oh, hey, in fact, I had one today where I was like, all right, that's good. I took that from Dad, and that's good. Really, today, I had that thought. I can't remember what it was about. I'll think about it. Anyway, but I think I had now two new people in my head where I would be like, oh, man, that was so self-destructive. I went through a very, I think you have to call it a self-destructive period in my career where I kept somehow working on projects that exploded. And I was completely innocent. And after this happened 3 or 4 times, I thought, I wonder how much I'm contributing to this. I think the Herman in me needs to come out, and I need to get rid of him. And similar with Joe, more of a, all right, how did Joe do it? God damn it, why don't you be successful? All right, what did Joe do? They became models both for good and for ill. I don't know if that answers your question or gives you more information than you need.
Hi, I'm curious, how do you guys know each other? What is the history of the relationship between you two?
Well,
Tinder.
I think we leave it there. How do we? Amor went to Yale with my wife, Jane.
I was friends with Jane, and we were acquaintances, or acquaintances plus, or however you want to put it, in college. And then, whatever, 20 years later, we ended up living on the same block. So,
We're neighbors.
Yeah,
we're neighbors. We're neighbors. And Amor came over. I remember you were at dinner with I think Dave Gilbert, who's also a mutual friend. Who's a great writer. And this was during the halcyon days of 2012 when I thought I cracked my book. So I started talking about it for the first time in years. And I remember telling Amor, I got this book. Yeah, I'm nearly done. And
that's true.
That was about halftime.
Yeah, right.
Has the book given your children greater insight into you?
You'd have to ask them. I don't know. During the period of time when I thought I was going to be in it, my daughter Gracie said, I think you should change the names. I think you should be, and she was then 8, and she said, I think you should make it the Milne family. And she had like a first name for Herman and a first name for Joe and a name for me. I can't remember. I think I was like Arnold Milne. And I was like, oh, let me like Winnie the Pooh? She said, no. So, Lily, my older daughter, claims to have finished it and liked it.
Did they read it or listen? Because you do the audio.
I do the audio.
That, yeah, right.
Quite a ham. No, they read it. Lily read the galleys. Yeah.
Is the documentary still percolating? And if it is, how did the work on the book maybe influence your thoughts about what you're going to do with the film?
Well, yeah, film. So, no, it's fine. We can call it that. The documentary does still exist as a possibility, and I'm much more. There was a period of time when I was like, forget it, I'm done. I mean, after this long, I don't want to deal with this story anymore. But now, I am actually interested and intrigued by just the fact that I have all these tapes, and they sound great. And I listened to Orson Welles recently on the tape, and Houseman in 1973, John Houseman, and it's great. It's good stuff. There's a section in the book. One of Herman's doomed projects was a movie he intended to make about Hitler. Every once in a while, he would come up with something that he cared about, and when the rise of Hitler terrified and infuriated him, and he wrote a screenplay called The Mad Dog of Europe, and the Hitler character was named Adolf Mittler. And anyway, it's a long story, but it's a neat little section of the book, and there's a company in England that's making a documentary about that film that was never made. And they've been talking to me about, well, can we get our hands on your audio tapes? Because maybe there's some stuff in there. And that has reignited my thinking, well, sure, you can use it, but I have to use it first.
And you made a fleeting reference to Mank. I'm just wondering if you might be able to give us insight as to how we should probably view that as a non-documentary.
Well, the thing about Mank is, if someone came to you, well, I shouldn't do this, if someone came to you and said, we're going to make a movie about your grandfather, and we're going to put maybe the best actor in the English language who's going to play him, and it's a fantastic director, and it completely evokes the time and place, and your grandfather is going to be, the performance is going to be warm and witty and wise, and your grandfather is going to be turned into a combination of Bugs Bunny and William Shakespeare and Oscar Schindler. It would be awfully churlish to complain. And when people come up and say, God, didn't you love it? Isn't it so amazing? I'm like, yeah, it's great, it's great. I'm a reed in the wind, you know, when people come up and say, well, they sure did get a lot wrong, and they took a lot of liberties, and it was kind of dramatically inert and hard to understand and overly about a movie that was a creative explosion of shambly, improvisational Jewish genius, I think, yeah, I sort of agree with that too.
This is not so much a question, it's something I loved in the book, and is that you sort of do a pocket history of Hollywood as you're doing it. And one thing in particular, and some work I've done myself, is that it struck me that when Herman arrived, people don't really appreciate how different silent era Hollywood was from talking era Hollywood. People do know that one thing was, for example, you couldn't have the wild parties anymore because people had to be up in the morning doing go home at night learning their lines for the next day. Didn't have to do that in the silent era. You could party all night.
And you could be hungover and it didn't matter.
Can't do that. But really, the entire system changed. Everybody who went through it said all the fun went out of it. It got really did become the factory where you just, 5.5 days a week, people are expected to work on Saturday morning, and you just churned it out. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Herman just, came at a certain time and place, and that was the Hollywood he knew, and somehow didn't get with the game, didn't get with the plan. Joe arrives when it's going strong, and he can swim in that ocean. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that crucial 10-year.
Yeah, well, the age difference, Herman was only there for 3 years before Joe arrived, but I think that I think you're right. It's a good question because, Herman, it was a party town. It was a wild and crazy party town, and you could, Herman famously throwing up at a party, a fancy party, and then saying, "Oh, don't worry, the white wine came up with a fish." Ha ha ha. But by the time Joe gets there, it's a serious place. It's a place of industry, and Herman, I don't think it mattered that Herman, it's not that Herman didn't change with the times, it's just that Herman wanted to be a partier, and that's what he wanted in New York. He had developed a reputation. Ben Hecht called him the Voltaire of Central Park West. He was the life of every party. And that's great and terrific, but it doesn't necessarily put food on the table, and it certainly doesn't keep food on the table if you're also a gambler. But yeah, it became a company town, and Joe saw it right away and was happy to just, okay, I'm going to join the Young Writers Program here at this lot, and I'll do what I'm supposed to do. And Herman just didn't take any of it seriously.
I was just going to say, over the course of doing this, has your opinion or have the best films of Herman or Joe changed in your mind at all?
The best films? No. The best films are Citizen Kane and All About Eve. My favorite films have not changed. I've come to, I really appreciated films like $1 Million Legs, and which is the one film that the two of them ever worked on. It's a fantastic movie with W.C. Fields and Jack Oakey from 1932 or 3. It's set at the LA Olympics, and it's just crazy and anarchic. It's like a Marx Brothers movie without the Marx Brothers. And Joe is credited as one of the two writers. Herman was credited as a producer. Of course, my grandmother said Herman wrote the whole thing. So that one was elevated. I've always loved Pride of the Yankees. I think A Letter to Three Wives is much, I don't know why it's fallen, people just don't talk about it, but it's a great movie. And the Five Fingers Five Fingers is a good movie of Joe's. It's sort of like a Hitchcockian thriller with James Mason, very chilly and weird. Something Last Summer, and Sleuth isn't terrible. And most important, Cleopatra. I think Cleopatra got a bum reputation, a bum rap. The only thing that we haven't really talked about, or one thing that I just want to make sure I say, is the great tragedy of these guys' lives is that they were so driven by competition. Not just competition with each other, but competition with the world. And it fostered a sense of just endless ambition that feeds on itself, and it's sort of a bottomless pit. And that was the great original sin of Franz Mankiewicz, and the great tragedy, the thing that on the cousin texting thread that I have with my cousins, we all joke about, and we try so hard to be nice to each other and be supportive of each other and not be competitive, and not make snarky remarks. But that text exchange, man, I mean, sometimes the wit is so, you can't keep up, and sometimes it's like, all right, just everybody calm down, let's just, love you guys, you know, can we just say that? So anyway, I just felt like that is sort of what the book is mostly about, if it's about anything, other than what I did for the last 19 years.
Let's give them a